In the late 17th century, in the kingdom called Muscovy, two brothers sat on the throne of the Tsar. The brother Tsars, Ivan V and Peter I, ruled a far-flung empire of isolated villages, cities, and towns, a place where daily life had changed little since the Middle Ages.
In the 17th century, Muscovy was definitely stuck in a medieval time warp, and it seemed backward by any measures. Muscovite Russia had not experienced the Renaissance. It had not experienced the scientific revolution of the 17th century.
Born in a medieval environment, the young Tsar Peter was captivated by everything modern. Anything new, anything from the West, people, ideas, even clothes. In 1696, Peter's half-brother and co-Tsar, Ivan V, died. As Pyotr Alexeyevich Romanov assumed sole control of the Russian throne, he declared his lifelong goal:
to break the bonds of the inflexible customs of Muscovy and to lead this country toward a new day, which shall be better than this.
And for Peter, Russia's new day dawned not in the East, but in the West, in Europe.
There was no alternative in the end, because if one was going to survive, you had to westernize, because the alternative to westernizing was essentially to be run over by one's European neighbors.
For Peter, one thing above all symbolized the new Russia he hoped to build: ships, warships, transports, merchant ships. As Tsar, Peter would build his fascination into a navy, a force that would change Russia and the world.
Peter had a passion for all sorts of knowledge, but shipbuilding from a young age was something that just fascinated him. And he learned everything he could possibly learn about shipbuilding.
But as a potential maritime power, Peter's kingdom had one crippling drawback. Russia, the largest nation on Earth, was practically landlocked. In the north, Sweden and Poland held the Baltic coast. In the south, the Ottoman Empire encircled the Black Sea. Peter wanted a seaport for Russia, a window on the world and the West.
He wanted to take Russia out of its Muscovite isolation and backwardness and communicate with the West, communicate with them in terms of technology, in terms of ideas, in terms of exchanging goods. And for that, he needed warm water ports.
At 23, the Tsar set his sights on the Black Sea's warm waters and the Turkish stronghold of Azov. 1695. Peter and his army marched south on Azov. The Tsar posted himself to the front-line artillery.
Peter, from almost day one of the Azov campaign, has seen action, and that continues for most of his life. He's very much a guy who wants to be where the action is and does not spare himself, is willing to be out there and be in danger.
But even with the warrior Tsar manning the guns, the Turks sent Russia home in defeat. The setback gave Peter a new insight. To capture the naval outpost he craved, first he needed a navy to lead the attack. The Tsar ordered up a fleet of battle galleys. He needed them finished in 5 months. But Russia had never been a naval power. First, they had to build shipyards and train the builders before they could build the ships. Peter himself led the effort.
He was right there hammering nails and building. And it was through him that Russia's first navy was created. Nothing resembling a navy had ever existed before Peter.
Next spring, the untested Russian flotilla cruised down the River Don, Peter himself at the helm of his flagship. He insisted his men not call him Tsar or Admiral, but simply Captain. On land, the Russian army again attacked the Turks at Azov. And from the sea, Peter and his new navy backed the troops with a withering naval bombardment.
Considering that the first campaign had been a failure and had had very serious, heavy losses, the second time was a piece of cake. So in that sense, he starts a pattern of, even though he might fail initially, he still won't give up on his objective. Militarily speaking, he'll come back even stronger. real quick.
A taste of naval power had at last won Russia a port on the Black Sea. But Peter wanted more. He wanted the secrets of the high-tech warships of the great Western navies. And so the Tsar of Russia left his kingdom to seek out the know-how he craved. No Tsar had ever before set foot outside the kingdom. No Tsar had ever even seen Europe. Peter was going to shatter tradition. The winter of 1697, Peter and some 200 nobles, craftsmen, musicians, servants, and a troop of dwarves headed west on a year-and-a-half-long European road trip. To escape the tedious burdens of royalty, the Tsar himself often masqueraded as a common sailor.
He wanted to absorb as much knowledge as he possibly could without the trappings of formality and court ritual and all of that. So he wanted to, observe unnoticed. It was kind of difficult to be unnoticed, at his height. But he didn't want to be known as the Tsar. He just wanted to be known as a traveling student.
For a self-taught craftsman, Western Europe offered the ultimate education. He studied printing, iron casting, paper making, even how to render whale blubber. He took classes in surgery and anatomy in Leyden, art in Leipzig, and dentistry in Dresden.
He was kind of a jack of all trades. He had such a passion for life and for experimentation that he not only wanted Russia to build a navy, but he wanted to learn how to be a shipbuilder himself. He wanted not only more Western style, more Western standards of medicine, but he himself practiced dentistry and practiced on some of his unfortunate men. I'm sure that his talents were pretty much limited to pulling out people's teeth, and that was about it.
He was observing an anatomy course in Holland, and they produced a dissected corpse. And all his comrades grew really squeamish when that happened. I mean, they were just repulsed by this, because it was just an unusual thing at the time. And Peter was just mortified at their squeamishness. He was embarrassed and angry. And in retaliation against it, he made every one of them stand up, march down to the table, and take a bite out of the corpse. It was just his way of saying, stop it.
Peter's greatest hunger was for nautical science. In Holland's finest shipyard, he apprenticed himself to a master shipwright. Then, Russia's carpenter Tsar learned how to build a 28-gun frigate from the keel up. But even with a Dutch ship-of-the-line to his credit, Peter wasn't satisfied. The British ruled the seas, so the Tsar headed for England.
He knows the reputation also of the British fleet, and the British very much cultivate that. So they provide a craft for him to sail on the Thames, and although he rams a couple of other vessels while he's learning to pilot this vessel, he does enjoy this, and he, at the end of this, all says that all things being equal, he'd really rather be an admiral in the British Navy than anything else.
The English offered Peter a fine manor house for his stay. The Tsar's host would come to regret the hospitality.
And they tear the place up. They mess up the plantings, the hedge. They shoot up the house.
A few months later, a bill which was presented for damages caused to the house by the Russians. And these damages included paintings on the walls which had shots fired into them, paving stones ripped up, windows smashed, furniture soiled in various ways.
He was, on some levels, a frat boy, in that he would just drink himself silly. And he would, often while he was on tour around Russia, around Western Europe, he would be visiting people's houses, and it just left a wake of destruction behind him.
When the rowdy Russians wore out their welcome in one land, they moved on to the next. July 1698, after 16 months on the road, Peter's entourage was partying in Vienna when an urgent message arrived from Moscow. Emboldened by Tsar Peter's extended absence, reactionary Streltsy regiments were stirring up revolt yet again. Peter's European apprenticeship ended abruptly. the jack-of-all-trades Tsar headed home to assert himself as Russia's unquestioned taskmaster. For 16 months, Tsar Peter I had reveled in the shipyards and palaces of Western Europe. When he returned home in 1698 and compared his realm with the West, Russia's supreme autocrat wasn't happy. His capital, Moscow, struck Peter as primitive and gloomy. Russia's nobility, the boyars, seemed medieval in their long beards and caftans. The Orthodox Church wielded far too much power at the Tsar's expense. And to top it off, the Streltsy, the army's die-hard conservative musketeers, were in open revolt. Peter resolved to change it all. He dreamed of a new nation, a westernized Russia, an empire inspired by and wedded to Europe, a gilded land of order, progress, and power. He started his revolution with a little barbering.
He was known to rip people's beards right out with his bare hands at the roots, and beards to him were just something that said old barbaric way. It was a tangible way of dragging the nation forward.
The Tsar ordered a complete change of clothes for his noblemen. Boyars caught in the traditional long kaftans of Muscovy had their robes cut short on the spot.
What he's saying to the Russians, certainly to the Russian nobility, is you can't be very Russian anymore. You have to be Europeans. You have to re-educate yourself to act out the life of European gentlemen and gentlewomen.
Peter ruffled feathers all over the place. I mean, what he was proposing radical changes. He wanted to drag Russia literally out of the Dark Ages, kicking and screaming, with the force of his own will.
If his new Russia called for blood sacrifice, the Tsar had no qualms. He saved his greatest wrath for the Streltsy, Russia's reactionary musketeers.
He never really forgave the Streltsy for having murdered so many members of his immediate family, and he sentenced 1,182 members of the Streltsy to execution. And it was widely rumored, and I think it was true, that Peter himself participated in the beheading of many of these Streltsy.
One obsession would shape Peter's entire reign: to create a Russian port on the Baltic coast, a window that would open Peter's kingdom to the world. But in 1700, the Baltic coast belonged to another nation and another bold young king, Charles XII of Sweden. Born and bred a warrior, Sweden's King Charles would make Peter and Russia pay dearly for his Baltic dream. The cost? The blood of thousands and 20 years of war. The duel began late in the year 1700. Peter's army, 40,000 strong, marched on Narva, the Swedes' Baltic stronghold. With only 8,000 men, Charles was outnumbered 5-1. But in a blinding snowstorm, Sweden's warrior king seized the moment.
Now is the time. With the storm at our backs, they will never see how few we are.
The Swedes charged out of the blizzard and completely overwhelmed the Russians.
Peter, who had all these dreams of making Russia a superb military power, met ignominious defeat. His 34,000 soldiers were trounced by Charles's army of 8,000.
Convinced that Russia was a paper tiger, Charles turned west to attack Poland. He would save Tsar Peter for later.
What Narva did to Peter is to convince him that all of the resources of the vast country which was under his control had to be put to serve one purpose and one purpose only, and that was to build Russia into a military power.